other side. Only human spirits reincarnate, so humans are the greatest of all beings in creation, snarled Tolhuaca. Coco took a step back, but only a single step. He squared off against his counterpart, jutting his chin slightly. I accept that, said Coco through gritted teeth. He took a deep breath. But also, wisdom knows all knowledge is incomplete, and that must also include the doctrines. A gasp went up from the watching crowd. Himilco of the High House of Vigilance stood up slowly. All eyes turned to them. The willful rejection, they said slowly into the sudden silence, or perversion of the orthodox doctrines of the faith. There was a chorus of muttering. Tolhuaca folded her arms triumphantly, nostrils flaring. Coco licked his lips nervously. Wisdom teaches us, he began, and then trailed off. He blinked several times, then set his shoulders. Wisdom teaches us that only fools accept hearsay as truth. There was another wave of muttering and a few gasps. You are quoting heresy, said Himilco, their voice flat and threatening. Are you truly comparing the doctrines of the faith to hearsay? Are you certain you wish to do this for these creatures? These orcs? These... Someone cleared their throat in the doorway. All eyes turned to see who had interrupted Himilco. Lalok the traveller, recently returned from distant lands, walked calmly across the floor to stand between the three arguing Prasta. Have any of you actually met an orc? Asked Lalok mildly. Heads shook around the room. Because I have. I spent a year or so in the Empire, and I actually spoke to them. They are people. They are real as tables. There is no doubt that they can choose virtue, even if they do not reincarnate. But so what? That's not what we're really debating here. Tolhuaca looked askance at Himilco, who bridled at Lalok's tone. We are debating doctrine, not... No, interrupted Lalok politely. That is not what you are really talking about, is it? Be honest, Himilco. This is not really about doctrine at all. Himilco's face twisted into a mask of fury. How dare you accuse me of dishonesty? He growled. The virtuous face unwelcome truths, said Lalok, his own voice suddenly cold and hard, like an unexpected blade. And the truth is that you are all trying to answer the wrong question. And until you realize what the right question is, you are building your house on shifting sands. So ask yourselves, if this is not about doctrine, and it is not about orcs, what is this really about? Overview. The Sumer Republic and the Empire in theory have a shared faith. Both enshrine the teachings of the Way as the only accepted religion. Sadly, this shared religion has done more to divide the two nations in recent years than anything else. There have been several bones of contention, and the Imperial Synod recognized these in spring 383 YE, with a judgment in the General Assembly agreeing to make no further changes to doctrine and to recognize no new paragons and exemplars until a symposium could be held to discuss the future. That symposium has now taken place, albeit in fairly reduced circumstances. A single Sumer, Cardinal Casati of the High House of Prosperity, met with delegates chosen to represent the Empire. Viviane de Coeur de Feu, Huel Summercrow, Clarice Novarion, Astrid Fjellrevening Retzia de Tessato, and Severin Tehard von Holberg. After the meeting, Cardinal Casati returned to Sumer and raised an agreed-upon statement of principle, and as a consequence, it appears that the Sumer have reached a momentous decision. The Symposium. During the spring equinox, a small contingent of priests from the Sumer Republic visited Anvil to meet with their opposite numbers in the Imperial Synod. Due to a series of unfortunate events, only a single cardinal and his aides were able to actually attend the meeting. A semi-formal discussion ensued regarding the challenges posed by two proud and ambitious nations both pursuing a common faith. With some difficulty, All parties to the symposium were able to agree that the Summa and the Empire agree on several points: the nature of the seven virtues, the role of the labyrinth, the importance of inspirational figures, and so on. However, that left two fundamental points on which it was clear that the synods of Summa and the Empire could never agree, at least not currently. The first is on how the way should be spread. The Empire, thanks perhaps to the fact it is made up of many nations, tends to favour a diplomatic approach. They rely on negotiation and compromise as often as not, and are prepared to tolerate other faiths and beliefs about the way, up to a point. The Summa, on the other hand, are a single united nation and are not prepared to tolerate other religions. For them, the way is self-evidently true, and those who will not accept it are treated as enemies. One approach favours the word, the other the sword. Both nations share the ultimate goal of converting everyone to the practice of the way, but no agreement was possible on how that should be done and what that ultimately means. The other is the status of orcs as participants in the way, as lay followers, priests, and as inspirations. The doctrine of the ancestors and the howling abyss have been extensively discussed in Summa, as has their implications for the doctrine of human destiny. The difficulties the Summa Prasta have had reconciling these ideas is a major sticking point. Yet it is also an illustration of where the fundamental problems lie with the relationship between the two synods. The Summa Synod agrees that it will take at least a generation to reach a decision about whether there is a role for orcs in the way, and what that role should be. Cardinal Cosati, Spring Equinox 383YE, upheld, passed with a greater majority. A generation or more. Following the meeting, Cardinal Cosati returned to the holy city of Timoj and put an agreed-upon statement of principle before the Summa General Assembly. Unlike the Imperial Synod, the General Assembly has few legal powers. Those powers tend to belong to the powerful Assembly of the Way, but it is commonly used to determine the opinions of the nation as a whole. In this case, the Cardinal's statement apparently spawned half a dozen other statements from various factions within the Summa Synod. Some priests denounced the statement, asserting that it would not take a generation to determine that orcs have no place in the way. Others took the opposite stance, that there was no need for extensive discussion, and it was self-evident that orcs should be accepted into the way just as humans are. One alternative statement argued that a generation was too long, and that with sufficient focus the problem could be solved within the decade, while still another statement suggested that the new doctrines were unnecessary, and that it did not actually matter whether orcs could reincarnate or not, as long as they acknowledged the importance of the seven virtues, although clearly they could not be Prasta, nor could they be paragons or exemplars. The debate apparently became quite heated. In the end, however, Cardinal Cosati's statement was the only one that achieved a greater majority, and it did so by a sizable margin. The Summa Synod cannot and will not accept the changes in doctrine the Empire has made, not without many years of further argument, debate, discussion, and investigation. The two synods have diverged on matters of doctrine, and now must decide what to do about it. What does this mean? The Summa Assembly of the Way, in conjunction with the Council of Eight, will now discuss what to do in light of this statement. In their role as diplomat to the Empire, Oxtitojin, censor of wood, metal and stone of the High House of Pride, has ensured that the Imperial Synod is aware of the situation. The Summa Council and Assembly are still debating the practicalities, but their intention is to formally announce their separation from the Imperial Synod. There is no doubt that Summa owes a debt of gratitude to the Imperial Synod, writes Oxtitojin on behalf of the cardinals of the high houses. Your wayfarers helped to fan the embers of our faith into the roaring fire that it is today. Without your mentorship, we might have fallen back into the darkness. Yet there comes a time for every parent where they must acknowledge that their children are no longer children, and allow them to walk out into the world, to face it on their own terms. Pride and ambition demand nothing less, and we are agreed that the time has come for us to make our own way. Nothing has been formalized yet, but in the opinion of Oxtitoshin, it is simply a matter of time. The Sumar Synod will shortly announce itself to be equal to and separate from the Imperial Synod. Due to the success of the informal symposium during the spring equinox, the desire of the Council of Eight is to separate on good terms. The Sumar want to become independent of the Imperial Synod, but they want the separation to be handled diplomatically. The Empire will remain Sumar's most important ally in the wider world, fellow members of the Liberty Pact and travellers on the way. To achieve this, the Sumar are going to use the coming solstice to place the following statement of principle before their General Assembly to cement this understanding, at least in the immediate future. The Sumar Synod is equal to and separate from the Imperial Synod. There are as many paths to virtue as there are paths of virtue. While we differ with the Imperial Synod in some regards, in others we are of one mind. Where there is conflict between us, let us settle it through debate, and where there are threats to the way from outside, let us be united against them. General Assembly. Oxtitoshin suggests that the Council of the Nine present an equivalent statement of principle to their own General Assembly. Should both judgments pass, then it will do a lot to reduce tensions between Sumar and Imperial priests, especially when they are engaged in missionary activities. If both judgments pass with a greater majority, then this will ensure that there are good relations between the two nations going forwards, at least from the Sumar side. A peculiar détente. One element that was raised during the symposium at Anvil was the proposal that it might help to smooth relations between the Republic and the Empire if the priests of one nation were able to raise statements of principle in the other nation, to gauge the feelings of their opposite numbers as much as anything else. The Council of Eight, the General Assembly, and the Sumar House of the People, their equivalent of the Senate, are all leery of this proposal. Membership of the Sumar Synod, the ability to raise and vote on judgments, is restricted to Sumar citizens, just as membership of the Imperial Synod is restricted to Imperial citizens. While there is a will for amicable cooperation, the proposal is seen as going too far. Oxtitoshin has a compromise to suggest. The role of the censor of wood and stone, an archaic title that dates back to a time when the Sumar were more interested in acquiring resources than diplomatic compromise, is to speak to outsiders and, in a way, to share their concerns with the people of Sumar. They guess that the ambassador to the Sumar Republic has a similar role in the Empire. It would be entirely appropriate for diplomats to ask each other about the opinions of the Synod in the other nation, and where that opinion was not clear, to ask an allied priest to raise a suitable statement of principle to determine it. Rather than needing any new formal powers, this would simply be an example of diplomats building on their existing roles. More practical concerns. Previously, the Sumar Synod had asked the Imperial Synod to refrain from recognizing new paragons and exemplars and making any kind of change of doctrine. Those requests were based on the idea that the two synods would remain part of the same religion. With separation imminent, this requested forbearance no longer appears necessary. The Assembly of the Nine or the General Assembly may wish to raise a statement of principle addressing the words of Lord Edward Novarion from Spring 383 YE, that a year has passed or that an agreement has been reached. The Imperial Crown. There is also the matter of the Imperial Crown. Allegedly stolen by League citizen Guillermo de Tassato, the crown was delivered to the Sumar shortly before the coronation of Imperatrix Lisabetta. During the symposium, Cardinal Cosati expressed their own concerns about this situation, that the theft of the crown was clearly a wicked act in the eyes of any virtuous pilgrim of prosperity or pride, and that they were not the only one who felt like this. While the main focus has been on the matter of the two synods, there has apparently been a great deal of discussion about the crown. News reaches the Empire that the Assembly of the Way and the House of the People are in agreement. The crown should no longer be in the hands of the Sumar Republic. Accordingly, it will be placed on a ship under careful guard by Prasta of the High House of Vigilance, and will be returned to the Empire as soon as possible, Most likely it will arrive in time for the autumn equinox.